Little beggar girl bursts into Millionaire's funeral crying, "Father, why did you die without knowing me?" Shocking everyone. Richard built his empire with intelligence and tireless ambition, turning his construction company into one of the largest in the country, erecting grand buildings and accumulating an undeniable fortune. Respected and feared, his coldness in business was as striking as his strategic vision. For him, wealth meant immortality. He believed that by ensuring his name was remembered, he would win the one battle no one escapes, the battle against time. Thus, he worked without rest, striving to consolidate his legacy and become unforgettable. By his side, Jennifer was the epitome of sophistication and strength. With a striking presence and flawless elegance, she and Richard formed the perfect image of stability and power. Though distant, they made for an admired and respected couple, united more by status than affection. Together, they created a grand life, sustained by appearances and domination over everything and everyone around them. However, not even all the success in the world could protect him from the inevitable. The illness arrived without warning, sneaky like a shadow creeping through the cracks of life. At first, Richard ignored the signs, the unusual fatigue, the persistent pains, the weakness that, for a man of his determination, seemed impossible. But over time, the symptoms intensified, becoming an obstacle that neither his willpower nor his money could overcome. The best doctors were summoned, the most advanced treatments tried, but nothing was enough. The disease advanced relentlessly, reducing him little by little to a fragile, unrecognizable version of himself. Richard, who had always believed in the absolute power of money, discovered on his deathbed his only limitation. No fortune could buy more time. When the last hope dissipated, Jennifer already knew the inevitable. Death, indifferent to the empire he had built, took him without allowing for a fight, offering no choice. And then, the man who seemed unshakable departed, leaving behind a vast legacy, but also a void that neither his businesses, his influence, nor his lack of heirs could fill. In the days following Richard's death, everything was meticulously planned. The wake would be formal, discreet, and flawless, reflecting the grandeur of his life. Jennifer supervised everything with her usual coldness. The casket would remain closed, the tributes would be brief, and nothing would escape her control. But as she observed the preparations, a quiet discomfort began to grow within her. And then, what would remain once the formalities were over? That night, before going to bed, she knew that the next day would bring the final farewell. The day of the wake had arrived, and the funeral hall was filled with influential figures, businessmen, politicians, and socialites, who, though dressed in mourning, maintained a firm posture, laden with formality. There were discreet murmurs between handshakes, controlled expressions of sorrow and condolences that seemed more like protocol than genuine grief. Everything there was flawless, from the sober decoration to the arrangement of the seats, reflecting the grandeur of Richard's life. An atmosphere of absolute respect, where every word was measured, where every gaze conveyed the solemnity of the moment. Jennifer stood there by the closed casket, receiving automatic greetings from people who had never been close to her husband, but made sure to show their presence. Her face maintained composure, but inside there was a strange emptiness, a sensation she couldn't explain. Richard was gone, and with him a part of her life that, though built on appearances and convenience, had still been her reality. She didn't cry. She wasn't the type of woman to shed tears in public. But deep within, something stirred uncomfortably, as if Richard's absence had left more than just a space in the house. It had left a silence in Jennifer's very fate. It was then that the tranquility was shattered. The soft murmur of the wake was interrupted when an unexpected presence crossed the entrance of the hall. The small, fragile figure of a girl appeared in the room, her bare feet hesitantly touching the marble floor. Her pale and dirty face bore a lost look, filled with something no one there recognized: genuine despair. The eyes turned toward her one by one, first with curiosity, then with confusion, and finally with discomfort. The girl moved slowly, each step weighed down by an invisible burden. It wasn't haste that propelled her, but a silent grief that consumed her from within. Her eyes landed on the closed casket in the center of the room, and there all hesitation disappeared. As if drawn to something greater than herself, she walked to the center of the hall, ignoring the elegant clothes, the expensive perfumes, and the surprised and indignant expressions rising around her. When she finally reached the casket, her small knees buckled. She placed her trembling hands on the cold wood and, unable to contain the pain she carried, collapsed right there. Her fragile body curled, her shoulders shaking, and the tears finally fell uncontrollably. Her voice came out quietly at first, a broken whisper of emotion. But then, as if the words burned within her chest, she broke into a wail that echoed throughout the hall. "Father, why did you die without recognizing me?" The hall froze. The silence that followed was so absolute that the sound of the girl's crying filled every corner. The eyes turned toward her in disbelief, shock, and indignation. She was an intruder. Her presence clashed with the environment that had been meticulously prepared for the farewell of a man whose life had been marked by power and ostentation. Uncomfortable murmurs spread among the guests, speculating in muffled voices. Who was this girl? How dared she interrupt the ceremony with such an absurd scandal? Jennifer, who had remained still until then, felt her blood freeze. The girl's words echoed in her mind. Daughter. Was this child saying she was Richard's daughter? Her mind refused to accept it immediately, but her instincts, trained to detect threats and lies, told her this was too big to ignore. The girl remained there, clinging to the casket, her shoulders trembling in sobs. Her frail body spoke of a life of hardships. Her expression mingled anguish and desperation, as though this were her last resort, her last chance to be heard. Jennifer took a deep breath, controlling the wave of emotions threatening to rise within her. She couldn't let this spectacle continue in front of so many eager eyes. With firm steps, she crossed the hall, ignoring the whispers, and stopped before the girl. For a moment, she studied her closely. Small, thin, eyes deep, and an expression of someone who carried more weight than she should have. Jennifer, without altering her rigid posture, made a subtle gesture with her hand. "Come with me," she said, her voice low but filled with authority. The girl hesitated, her fearful eyes meeting Jennifer's, but there was no choice. If she stayed there, continuing to be the focus of judgmental gazes, she would be crushed before she could even explain her presence. Swallowing her fear, she slowly released the casket and followed Jennifer to a more secluded corner, away from the hungry stares. Once in a discreet hallway, Jennifer turned to the girl, crossing her arms, her gaze serious and inquisitive. "Now speak," she said, without preamble. "Who are you, and why are you claiming that Richard was your father?" The girl took a deep breath, fighting the tremor in her voice. Her eyes, shining with a mix of fear and hope, met Jennifer's before she finally spoke, almost in a whisper. "My name is Deborah," she murmured. My mother's name was Sarah." Upon hearing that name, Jennifer felt a slight shiver. She searched her memory, but couldn't immediately associate it with anything. She didn't know any Sarah, at least not right away. "Go on," Jennifer said, her voice firm but without hostility. Deborah took a deep breath before continuing. "My mother raised me alone. Throughout my life, she always told me that my father died before I was born. I never questioned it because because she never spoke much about him. She only said he was an important man, but that he was no longer here. She paused, swallowing hard. But when my mother got sick, when she realized she didn't have much time left, she decided to tell me the truth. She said my father had always been alive, and that he was Richard. Jennifer's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained impassive. "And why didn't your mother ever look for Richard?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Deborah lowered her head for a moment before lifting her gaze again. "She met my father many years ago, before I was born. She said it was a quick, intense romance, but it ended before he knew she was pregnant. My mother told me she tried to find him, but when she discovered he was already married, she was afraid. Afraid of being rejected, afraid he wouldn't believe her, afraid they'd think she was an opportunist. She said Richard was a powerful man, surrounded by influential people, and that a woman alone like her would never stand a chance against that. So, she decided to raise me alone without ever asking for anything." Jennifer kept her gaze fixed on her, analyzing every expression, every gesture, every hesitation. Could it be a scam, a well-rehearsed story? But there was something in those words, the way Deborah spoke them, that made it hard to judge too quickly. "And where is your mother now?" Jennifer asked, already suspecting the answer. Deborah's eyes filled with sadness. "Dead," she said in a whisper. "She died a few months ago. And after that, I was alone." Jennifer felt an odd tightness in her chest, but maintained her firm demeanor. "You have no relatives, no one to take care of you?" The girl shook her head. "No. After my mother died, they said I'd be taken to an orphanage, but I was afraid, so I ran away." Jennifer raised an eyebrow. "Ran away to where?" "To the streets," Deborah swallowed hard. "I spent weeks trying to learn more about my father, asking around, listening to conversations. Then I saw in the newspapers, I saw that he had died." Her voice trembled. "I just wanted to see him once. Just once. But when I got here..." Her eyes filled with tears again. It was too late. Jennifer remained silent. The story was too absurd to ignore, but also hard to believe at first. Deborah might be telling the truth, or maybe it was all an invention. But one thing was certain, the girl had no one. And somehow, that bothered Jennifer more than she could have imagined. Jennifer felt something stir inside her. An abandoned child, a girl who wandered aimlessly, who survived as best she could, all to find a father who never knew of her existence. It was hard to believe, but at the same time hard to ignore. She took a deep breath. She had to think clearly. She couldn't just accept that story without proof, but she also couldn't dismiss it so easily. The chaos this situation could cause was immense, not only because of the potential scandal, but also because of the impact it would have on everything Richard had built. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, not changing her tone. "We need more than just your word." Deborah looked at her desperately. "I'm not lying, I swear. I just wanted to know where I came from. I have no one else." Jennifer remained silent for a long moment. Deborah's words still echoed in her mind, carrying with them an unease she couldn't ignore. If it were a lie, it was a well-crafted one, wrapped in pain and genuine desperation. But if it were true, Richard had a daughter he never knew, who grew up without knowing her true origin, and now, before a closed casket, sought answers no one seemed capable of providing. She inhaled deeply, straightening her shoulders, taking the weight of that revelation. "We'll find out the truth," she said finally, her voice firm, determined. Deborah blinked, as if unsure she had heard correctly. "When?" she asked, hesitation evident in her voice. "After all of this is over." Jennifer glanced toward the hall, where guests still lingered, murmuring and casting suspicious glances their way. "Now is not the time nor the place." Deborah nodded slowly, wiping away the tears with the back of her hands. "But I have nowhere to go." Her voice came out in a whisper, and Jennifer felt something strange stir inside her. A weight that wasn't obligation, but was also not simply compassion. "You're coming with me," she said, without a second thought. Deborah looked at her with surprise, as if those words were impossible to believe. But she didn't question it. The wake continued on its course, with final farewells and automatic greetings. The weight of Deborah's presence still lingered in the air, transforming into barely concealed whispers among the guests. Jennifer ignored them all. Her focus was on something bigger. When the last guests finally left and the hall fell silent, Jennifer turned to Deborah. "Now, yes," she said, adjusting her coat. "Let's discover the truth." The girl didn't say anything, just nodded. Her expression was marked by exhaustion, but also by a quiet expectation. They left together for the outside. The night air was colder than Jennifer expected, and Deborah shivered slightly, hugging her arms around herself. Jennifer's car was waiting for them, discreetly parked. She opened the door and looked at Deborah. "Get in," she said, leaving no room for hesitation. The girl hesitated for a brief moment, as if pondering what was about to happen. But, seeing the firmness in Jennifer's gaze, she obeyed and got in. Jennifer did the same, closing the door with a decisive motion. The driver looked at her through the rearview mirror, awaiting instructions. "To the lawyer's office," she ordered. The car pulled away, cutting through the illuminated streets of the city, while Deborah remained silent, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jennifer took a deep breath, trying to calm the wave of thoughts pounding in her mind. She was about to put that girl in front of the man who knew all of Richard's financial and legal secrets. If there was anything that could be uncovered, it would be with him. When they finally arrived at the office, Jennifer stepped out of the car with determined steps, Deborah following hesitantly behind her. The lawyer's office was discreet but imposing, a serious environment where irrevocable decisions were made daily. Upon entering, they were greeted by a man in his middle years, impeccable in posture and attentive in gaze. Richard's lawyer, David, looked clearly surprised to see her at that hour. "Mrs. Jennifer," he raised an eyebrow. "What brings you here at such an unexpected time?" Jennifer was direct. "This girl claims to be Richard's daughter." David blinked a few times, scanning Deborah from top to bottom. The girl lowered her head, visibly uncomfortable under his scrutinizing gaze. "Richard's daughter," he repeated slowly. "That's a very serious claim. And that's why I'm here." Jennifer crossed her arms. "I need to know if there's any way to prove it definitively." David pondered for a moment, adjusting his glasses. "Well, there are few ways to verify such an allegation," he said finally. "We can investigate records, documents, but nothing would be as definitive as a DNA test." Jennifer nodded. "And Richard can't take that test." Her voice came out bitter, recalling the reason they were there. "But his parents are still alive." David narrowed his eyes. "Richard's parents?" He seemed to consider the idea. Yes, that can be done. The DNA of his parents can confirm whether Deborah shares the same blood." Jennifer turned to Deborah, who looked at her with a mix of hope and fear. "Are you willing to take that test?" Jennifer asked, her voice now softer but still filled with seriousness. Deborah nodded vigorously. Yes, I'll do anything. I just want to know the truth." David watched the scene, adjusting his glasses again. "I'll contact Richard's parents immediately," he said, picking up the phone. "If they agree, we can arrange the test as soon as possible." Jennifer crossed her arms, feeling a tight knot in her chest. What if it were true? David dialed quickly, and in just a few minutes, he awaited an answer on the other end of the line. Jennifer could hear Nicholas's voice, Richard's father, on the other side. "A daughter?" The elderly man's voice sounded surprised. This is serious?" "Very serious, sir. David replied. "We need a test to confirm." There was a long silence on the line. Then Nicholas spoke, his voice filled with restrained emotion. I want to know the truth." David exchanged a few more words before hanging up and looking at Jennifer. "They agreed," he said. "We can do the test tomorrow." Deborah let out a sigh of relief, but Jennifer only nodded, the knot in her stomach tightening even more. If it were true, everything would change. And if not, what would happen to that girl? She didn't know, but she knew the wheels of destiny had already started turning. The days that followed were long, heavy with a silent tension that settled among everyone involved. After the visit to the lawyer, David arranged for the DNA test swiftly, ensuring it would be done as quickly as possible. Deborah was taken to Jennifer's house that night. There was no other option. Leaving her alone, wandering the streets, wasn't something Jennifer even considered at that point. The girl accepted without argument, still wrapped in disbelief over what was happening. Jennifer's house, once Richard's, was spacious, luxurious, but cold. It was a home without soul, a place designed to reflect status, not warmth. Deborah noticed this as soon as she stepped inside. The flawless decor, the furniture arranged in a calculated way, the absence of any trace of disorder or life. There were no scattered photos, no family mementos, nothing that gave the environment a human touch. That first night, Jennifer showed Deborah to a guest room and gave her some clean clothes. "You can stay here until we have the results," she said, straightforward, but not unkind. Deborah nodded silently, holding the clothes against her chest. She didn't ask anything, didn't complain. She just went into the room and closed the door, as if she feared that the temporary shelter might be taken away at any moment. The following days were strange. Deborah remained discreet, almost invisible in that enormous house. She made no noise, didn't invade spaces that weren't hers, didn't question anything. She spent most of her time in the room, only coming out when Jennifer called her for meals. Lisa and Nicholas, Richard's parents, asked to see her, but Jennifer thought it better to wait. The test wasn't done yet, and the weight of that revelation needed to be handled with caution. Even with her controlled personality, Jennifer found herself observing Deborah more than she should have. The way the girl behaved, how she avoided prolonged eye contact, how she seemed to struggle against her very presence there. She still doesn't believe she deserves to be here, Jennifer thought, certain that the girl had been rejected so many times she had learned to make herself invisible. On the third day, Lisa called again, her voice heavy with anxiety. "When will we know?" she asked, her tone edged with quiet pleading. "Tomorrow," Jennifer replied, feeling a weight settle in her chest as she realized the waiting was affecting her more than she wanted to admit. The next morning, Jennifer took Deborah to the lawyer's office. The girl remained silent throughout the journey, her hands clasped in her lap, as she always did when nervous. When they arrived, David was already waiting. The white envelope rested on the table. And then, silence fell. A heavy silence, laden with the truth that would change everything. He read the results quietly for a few seconds that felt like hours. Then he lifted his eyes to Jennifer, then to Deborah, and finally to Richard's parents, Nicholas and Lisa, who sat nearby, visibly anxious. "The result is positive," David said, his voice neutral and professional. "Deborah is Richard's biological daughter." The impact of those words was immediate. Deborah's eyes widened, and she raised her hands to her mouth as though she feared it was a mistake. Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine, and Richard's parents exchanged glances, their faces a mix of surprise and emotion. Nicholas was the first to speak, his voice rough and trembling. "My God." He swallowed hard. "My son, left behind a daughter." Lisa placed her hands over her chest, her eyes misty. "I thought I'd never have a grandchild," she murmured. "But she..." She is blood of Richard. Deborah looked around at everyone, trying to process what she had just heard. So, it's true? Her voice was soft, hesitant. He was really my father? Jennifer breathed deeply, her gaze fixed on the girl. For the first time, there were no more doubts, no more room for speculation. Deborah was Richard's daughter. The truth was undeniable. Yes, Jennifer said, her voice softer than she expected. He was your father. Deborah couldn't hold back the tears. They weren't sadness or happiness, but an overwhelming relief. The confirmation that she wasn't a mistake, that she wasn't an imposter. Lisa, in an impulse, knelt before Deborah, taking her small cold hands in hers. "My dear, you're not alone anymore," she said, her voice choking. "You have a family." Nicholas, though a man of few words, simply nodded, his face marked by emotion. Jennifer watched the scene, and for the first time felt something different inside her. An unexpected warmth, an emotion that wasn't simply responsibility or duty. It was something deeper. She looked at Deborah again. That girl wasn't just a consequence of Richard's past. She was a part of him that fate had left behind. The truth was, Jennifer had never wanted children. Her marriage to Richard had always been a silent agreement, sustained by appearances and stability. There had never been room for sentimentalism, for bonds forged by affection. And now there was Deborah, a girl who should never have existed in her reality, but who somehow had become impossible to ignore. Jennifer looked at the girl beside her, small, fragile, yet incredibly strong. Deborah had been through things no one should ever face, let alone a child. She lost her mother, was cast to the streets, slept rough, and faced hunger, fear, and cruel loneliness. All while carrying the one thing left to her, the desire to know where she came from. She just wanted an answer, Jennifer thought, feeling a pang in her chest. And in the end, she found much more than she expected. Now Deborah was no longer just a lost girl. She was Richard's daughter. She was a part of him, a part he never knew existed, but which, ironically, fate had left behind. And if Richard were alive, what would he have done? Would he have accepted her? Would he have rejected her? Jennifer didn't know, but she knew she was alive. And that, in some way, was now her responsibility. It wasn't just out of moral duty. It wasn't just out of Deborah's suffering. It was also for Richard's name, for the honor of her husband, for the weight of the legacy he left behind without ever knowing. If Richard had the chance, would he have done something for her? The question echoed in her mind. If he had known he had a daughter, would he have let her go through all of this? Jennifer didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She couldn't leave her alone. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then broke the silence. "I'll adopt her," she said, her voice more certain than she had expected. Deborah blinked, surprised. "What?" Jennifer kept her gaze firm. "You have no one left, Deborah, but now you have me. You have your grandparents." She breathed deeply. "And I want you to stay." Deborah's eyes filled with tears once again, but this time they weren't of uncertainty. They were of something she didn't know if she had ever felt before. Hope. You would do that?" Deborah asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Jennifer replied without hesitation. "Not because I have to, not because it's an obligation, but because I want to." Deborah let out a sob and, without thinking, threw herself into Jennifer's arms. For the first time, Jennifer felt the warmth of a true embrace. Lisa began crying softly, and Nicholas looked at the scene with a light in his eyes that hadn't been seen in a long time. David smiled faintly and nodded. "Then we'll get the paperwork." Months passed, and slowly, Deborah began to leave behind the girl who arrived at the wake alone and lost. Jennifer, once so distant and cold, found herself transformed. She learned to be a mother without ever planning to be one. She learned that love wasn't a duty, it was an instinct that blossomed over time. Lisa and Nicholas welcomed her as though she had always been part of the family. To them, Deborah was the last living reminder of Richard, the peace that fate had returned to them. And for Deborah, every moment with them proved that, despite everything she had lived through, life could still be generous. What started as a scandal ended as a new beginning. Deborah arrived at the wake as an intruder, but left as part of a family that, unknowingly, had always been hers. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.